So welcome members, my name's Amanda, and what I'm going to go through today, which isn't something I haven't done before, but there's a lot of new members on the page now, and I thought I'd run through some really easy hybridization techniques that are used when doing Billbergias. They're the easiest to start with for those that are wanting to produce their own seed and to grow from seed. I've been doing this for a couple of years now, probably 4 or 5 years, so not that long, pretty much all the time for the last 4 or 5 years. Up to then, probably for 10 or 15 years before that, I dabbled a little bit, but didn't do it to the level that I've taken it to in the past 4 or 5 years. Billbergias are my main passion. They're the thing that I hybridize the most and that I've got the most access to, a really large gene pool of over 20 years of collecting Billbergias. So I've got lots of old varieties, species, as well as lots of new hybrids. And we've gone from wanting to make the really, really large type varieties, which was a big thing in the early 2000s and the beginning of, I suppose, the internet craze that happened, the invention of eBay, those types of things. Really big Billbergias were in high demand. Now our gardens are a lot smaller than they were 20 years ago, and so lots more smaller species are ideal, and people are wanting them. There are still those like myself who still really like these big ones, and that's what I'm hybridizing with at the moment. A couple of different stables, we call them, so different breeders. There's 4 different breeders in this little collection that I've got here at the moment. This particular large variety, which the inflorescent isn't even in camera, this particular variety has come from far north Queensland. Big red one, has this striation and this long cascading effect to it. It's still a large, very dramatic Billbergia. This one is from Russell Holzheimer. His stable name, or his prefix name, is Pollen, and he's from mid-north Queensland coast in Pollen. This is one of his that I've used before for breeding, so I do know that it's quite successful for transplanting the pollen from. This one here is one of my own that I did when I did the cross between these two. So this one I'm going to be taking some pollen from as well. There's another large one further out in the garden, which is off camera, which is Ross Draper, which is a really tall striated one, and I've taken pollen from that already. And then there's this one, which will get used later on. So it's quite unusual for a Billbergia to have either the variegation or the striation or the marginetus in it. So these aren't used for seed parent, but they are used for pollen, and it's got a lot of flowers that are starting to come out that I'll be taking pollen from and storing for future use. But for today's purpose, what we'll be doing is firstly emasculating these plants, and in order to do that I need to remove the pollen from the plants without adding pollen to the female receptive part. So what I'll do is I'll start with this plant. So this is Magicus. So on a flower, this very end tip piece, that's the female receptive part that the pollen gets put on. This part here. The pollen and the stigmas below need to be removed from each of them. It's a really simple step. It can be done with your fingertips if you're going to be doing just a really simple removing and not using, but because I'm going to save them, I've got a pair of little artery forceps, and or you can just get a pair of tweezers, any kind of scissors. And what I like to do is I just simply push away the female part that leaves me all of the male bits together, and I just give them a simple pull. You can cut them off as well, that's just as easy. So what you end up with is the little stigmas and the pollen in your containers. And you go along and you do that with all of the flowers, being very careful not to transfer any pollen at all back to your plant that you're going to be hybridizing, because the purpose of doing this is to make a new plant. So I don't want to self this plant by putting its pollen back on itself. I want to create a completely new variety. Now, knowing this particular plant that I'm doing, it's got very strong genes, and so a lot of the progeny end up being quite large anyway. Similar coloration and very similar flower. So nice strong genes. So I want to try to mix that up a little and do something completely different with it. So what I've got is pollen that I've removed from, like I said, the large plant that's out the back there, a Ross Draper. And so I've stored the pollen It's nice and fluffy and ready to use. Now, the easiest way that I know to get the pollen off the stigmas, not that you have to, you can just put them straight on without any issues. Or what I like to use is just a little bit of silica beads. You get these in lots of different products. You can buy them from the pharmacist as well. If you're lucky, they'll let you have some. So these itty bitty tiny silica beads, I simply add a few of them into my container that's got my pollen and my beads in it, and then make sure you cover your pollen up as well as cover up those silica beads, because we don't want them absorbing anything. And once you've got your pollen and your beads together, it's a simple shake. It loosens the pollen off the stigmas, and it makes it a lot easier for reapplying them. So you can do it just by using tweezers. I like to dip. It's much easier, it gives me a greater control. And I just dip the stigmas into my container with my pollen, and I just check to make sure there's enough pollen that's covering each of the little female receptors, which will then turn into seed. So the more pollen, the more seeds. If you don't have a lot of pollen, you don't get many seeds. So you want to really heavily load your plant with the pollen. Once that step's done, so at the moment I'm just going to do these 3 flowers. So once that step's been done, you need to mark each of your flowers. A couple of different ways you can do that. You can literally use a coloured pen like a Nico pen or a Sharpie, and you can mark it, your flower, because your flower's going to last for several months, even once the seeds are formed. I like to use little coloured zip ties. You can buy these from lots of sources, cheapy stores, eBay, that type of stuff. But each of these coloured zip ties simply slide over your plant, secured so they don't come off. They don't generally come off when you're only doing Billbergias. When you're doing other plants that you might be doing 30 or 40 different crosses on, you'll end up with a lot of different coloured tags. Now then, each of these stay in place for several months now as the seed develops, and that way when the seed develops I know exactly what the cross is, because tomorrow I might cross this plant with a completely different pollen, so I can cross it several times. What I then do is be sure that I've marked a tag with this being the seed plant, and the pollen that's been added to it in this case is Billbergia rostrata. Okay, so that one's been completed. It's ready to go. Now none of this can get wet now, has to stay dry for the next few days while that's taking. In 24 hours those flowers will have closed up anyway, protecting the source, but it still takes a couple of days for that pollen to make its way down to the ovum to produce eggs. So what I do is I take these plants away and move them into an area that they're protected, and that one's done. That's how we do some hybridization. Now we're going to move on to taking some seeds off.